Flying for some folks is all about convenience. So when the weather just gets bad, just how far would you push it to get home? Stick with us on Flywire as we look at what appears to be a really bad decision. Hi, I'm Scott Perdue, and today on Flywire, we're going to look at the recent Lear 35 accident on landing at Gillespie Field in San Diego. This was a routine flight home that ended with a bad decision. In this video, I want to look into the what and why of it and what lessons we can learn from that accident, tragic as it is. Let's look at this Lear 35 crash at Gillespie Field in depth. I know that quite a few others have covered this accident. In full disclosure, I haven't watched any of them, so I might be repeating something you've already seen. But hey, this is my take. This was an air ambulance flight returning from John Wayne, Orange County. Gillespie was their home airport, and there were 2 pilots and 2 flight nurses aboard the airplane, and nobody survived. It was night in San Diego on the return flight of 880 Zulu, and the crash occurred at 1917. That's 7:17 p.m. for those of you who don't know 24-hour clocks, on the 27th of December in 2021. Sunset was 16:50, so the sun was down. The reported weather 23 minutes before the crash was winds variable at 5, 3 miles visibility and mist, ceiling broken 2,000, overcast at 2,600. According to the Weather Service, there had not been any rain on the airport that day up to the crash, but the wind picked up from the west and rain fell just prior to 2100 or 9 p.m. I find that a little confusing because in some of the security camera footage, it sure looks wet on the ground, and the visibility looked a little worse than mist as well, than 3 miles in mist, but you can't really tell. Later shots of the crash site and recovery efforts were made after it had rained, so it showed that. Here's what happened. The FO was purportedly the pilot flying and was shooting the RNAV 17 to runway 17. The final approach path is about a 21-degree offset to the runway alignment, and it still counts as a straight in, but just barely. This is due to those big hills that are just north of the airport, one reaching to 2,700 feet. Runway 17 is nominally 4,145 feet long, and it has displaced threshold of 450 feet, leaving 3,695 of landing surface. Given that most jets use a touchdown zone of about 1,000 feet down the runway, that leaves about 2,700 feet to stop on. Given that the approach speed of the Lear was about 143 knots or 165 miles an hour, that's kind of short to land on, even with thrust reversers. And reversers were not common equipment on this model Learjet. I don't know if it had it or not. The approach minimums are 1,003 miles, which is basically marginal VFR, and puts them 981 feet above the runway. Remember, the ceiling was 2,000 broken. The weather was just good enough to execute the approach. A little bit more. Short runway, ceiling's just above minimums, and from that approach, it was probably best to circle to land on runway 27 or 9. Circling mins were 1,100 feet, with an important exception. There was no circling to runway 35 or 27 at night. So runway 927 was longer. Why not shoot an approach to that runway? Runway 9 has an RNAV, but it's restricted to slower category A and B airplanes because the turn radius of a Class C airplane like this Learjet is too large to clear the 900-foot hill 5 miles down the extended center line of runway. Actually, it's closer than that, but it extended center line at 27. Can't fly the approach to 9 at all. It's debatable whether you can shoot a circling approach to Class 9 to 9 in a Class D airplane. Lots of turning and climbing, and So, is there an approach to runway 27? And it happens that there is. It's a localizer D to runway 27. And that is, in fact, a circling approach with minimums of 1,552 feet for the Learjet. Oh, and one more thing, a circling approach to that runway at night is not allowed on 27. So they couldn't fly the 27 approach legally. Other issues are this approach has a nearly 7-degree glide path. Yeah, that's really steep. Yahoo, no wonder. Night. I'm not going to do that at night. That's outrageous. So what this crew decided to do was cancel IFR and request once they got to 17, request that visual approach to 27. In other words, they said they can fly and stay VFR. And in Class B, C, D, and E surface airspace, you can legally fly special VFR with 1 mile viz and stay clear of clouds. The airport is supposed to be reporting VFR, and that is what the tower at Gillespie was reporting. This is not the first time for this airplane. I don't know about the crew. The plain truth is that runway 17 is not suitable for a Learjet, but I expect they've been doing this a while, and here are 3 times previously that 80 Zulu executed the exact same maneuver. On the 925 at 2044, it landed at night with winds 290 at 6, 7 miles viz, 1600 overcast. 927 at 1600 local daylight, it did a visual approach to 27, winds 280 at 10, visibility 10, 2500 overcast. On 928 at 1724, daylight again, the same thing, winds variable 6, viz 10, few clouds at 3500. So the flight path of the accident flight was worse. They shot approach to lower winds, which drove them to begin that turn much later than they had before, moving it east, resulting in turn radius that displaced towards the mountain just northeast of the runway 27 center line. This is a habitual pattern with the crew on this airplane. One interesting fact here is that the runway 27 does not have approach lights, meaning that the runway edge lights are the only illumination for the runway available to the pilots. They did for the lights, and they did ask for the lights to be turned up.
Learjet 880 Zulu, Gillespie Tower, wind 19 at 5, runway 17, clear to land. Runway 17, clear to land. Yeah, of course, we'd like to squawk VFR for 80 Zulu. Learjet 80 Zulu, roger, runway 17, clear to land. Now we'd like to take runway 27, 80 Zulu. Learjet 80 Zulu, understand you're in your canceling IFR? Yes, sir. Learjet 80 Zulu, IFR cancellation received. You can overfly the field, make left traffic runway 27 right, runway 27 right, clear land. Change to runway 27 right, clear land. Runway 27 right, clear land. Can you drop the lights for us a little bit more? They're at 100% now.
The reply was they were already at maximum. They couldn't see it with all the other village lights there. Looking at that turn radius on 27th of December, it looks like the crew was struggling to locate the runway lights, and they relaxed the turn. Realizing they were getting close to the runway 27 center line, they began turning harder. Speed control wasn't too bad at the outset of the maneuver, but then deteriorated quickly. One human factor that possibly was at play here is the tendency to pull up in uncertainty. And we see that in the airplane gained 250 feet in the last 27 seconds, and it slowed down 14 knots. The last recorded speed was 130 knot ground speed, which equated to about 124 knots indicated, given the winds in the area. That's dangerously close to a stall, about 5 knots. Stall speed of the Lear 35 configured for landing is 96 knots, but the thing to remember is that speed is given at wings level. At 30 degrees of bank, the stall speed would be approximately 10% greater, and at 45 degrees, approximately 20% greater. And that's not adding a little g of, oh geez. This is a topographic view of the runway from the extended center line at just over 1,000 feet AGL, and you can see that there's a big damn hill on the right, and the actual crash site is at the very foothill of that mountain. You can see that right in the front. I expect that when the pilots realized where they were, a lot of G was added without thinking about it. It's just natural human tendency. I don't want to go there. There was virtually no margin above stall speed in that turn. And that's what it did, is it stalled and departed. I've seen the security video and I've heard the radio comm with the pilots, and I'm not going to include this here. Suffice it to say that they realized they were in a bad spot. Fortunately, there was nothing they could do about it, and I think the final report will say that they stalled and spun in. The concentration of the wreckage, how close together it was, and along with that nest video, it is plain to see that it departed. But the reality is that they were going to hit that mountain or stall, one or the other. Once they continued the turn to the northwest, they were committed. In all likelihood, they were both looking for the runway and not paying attention, and they totally lost SA, situational awareness. To some degree, they were operating in a familiar environment. They'd done this before, even at night. The workaround of declaring visual and landing on runway 27 was a regular thing. You could say that they had normalized deviance. This is an unsafe practice. At night or in the weather, I can see in good VFR doing this, but when things turn marginal, It's a completely different story. Just because it's illegal doesn't make it smart. I think it's very likely that both pilots were heads out looking for the runway, and neither was working on maintaining SA. And they missed the turn radius opening up at that critical juncture, continuing that turn to the northwest. This left them pointed at big rocks dangerously close, and remember, all of this happened at night. They couldn't see. Talk about stacking the deck against them. There is an early warning skill that would be good to acquire if you want to try something like this. I don't recommend it, actually. The skill having it, yes, but not trying this stuff. And the skill is paying attention to the hairs on the back of your neck. When they stand up, pay attention. If you haven't developed judgment that says this is a dangerous activity, then you need to look for another trigger when you make a bad decision. You got to have some kind of wake-up call to say, stop it, knock it off. When that trigger sounds off, call off what you're doing. Climb, declare an emergency, anything, but avoid the rocks at all costs. I would also say, don't stall the airplane. I would also say that more training in handling the airplane wouldn't hurt. Distraction keeps killing people, and we got to make it stop. I don't know how else to do it without talking about this. The training jet pilots receive in simulators just does not prepare them to make max performance turns like this close to the ground. I've been told that the standard profiles that the big box training companies use is circling at Memphis and JFK every time they do it. It's a canned training event. And I find it hard to imagine that such an event like this would qualify a bizjet pilot to circle close to the ground in lousy weather, or frankly, anywhere at all for that matter, unless it's JFK or Memphis. I talked with Dan Greider of Probable Cause about this briefly, and he lays the fault at the feet of the big box trainers. Inadequate training is his issue, and I can see it. In point of fact, the jet operator accident rate is much higher than the airlines, and these ad hoc circling visual approaches are a large part of that. About half a dozen ones we've seen videos on this year. Speaking to the airlines, they don't do circling approaches, and their safety record is significantly better. Here's a quick look at my ticket. These are airplanes that I flew on the line. Notice the circling approaches are VMC only, and they're just not done in the real world. Airlines don't do them. Even if you're proficient at max performance turns at slow speed, just a few hundred feet above the ground, at night, in the weather, flying this workaround concept is a terrible idea. A runway with no approach lights, just edge lights, and the city lights and everything, it's all drowned out. If you've seen some of my previous videos, I have a yardstick that I apply to situations like this. And that is, if the situation is dicey and the sortie isn't required to save democracy and our way of life, well, just don't go. Divert, don't take off. That way there'll always be tomorrow, and the weather will probably be better then. Convenient is not relative when you're dead. What does that mean? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and like and subscribe looks like this here, and then hit the bell for notification if you'd like to see those. I'd like to thank my Patreon supporters here as well. Without you guys, it'd be harder to do. Thanks. I appreciate it. If you'd like to support the channel, I'll leave a link below to the Flywire Patreon page for you to check it out. Thanks for watching. Oh, and there's some special video footage and stuff like that on Patreon. Just only those folks get to see. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Flywire.